Hi, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Awareness Podcast. My name is Susan Telford, and I'm here today with Steve Taylor. Hi, Steve. It's lovely to see you. Thanks for agreeing
Hi,
to this.
yeah, hi Susan, great to be with you.
So, for those of you that don't know Steve, I'll just read you his bio. Steve Taylor, PhD, is the author of many best-selling books on psychology and spirituality, and he is a spiritual poet. His newest book is The Adventure, a practical guide to spiritual awakening. Other books include Disconnected, How Connection Can Heal the World, Extraordinary Awakenings, The Clear Light, and The Leap. His books have been published in 20 languages, and he also writes blog articles for Scientific American and for Psychology Today. Eckhart Tolle has described Steve's work as an important contribution to the shift in consciousness which is happening on our planet at present. Steve lives in Manchester, England, with his wife and his 3 children. So, Steve, can we begin by talking about your journey to awakening? How did that unfold for you? I don't know your origin story, so I'm interested in that, how it all began.
It was very natural for me. It was, looking back, it was something that was inside me and which was kind of there from the beginning and which kind of came out and which unfolded naturally. So I became aware of it when I was a teenager. I began to have what I would now recognize as spiritual experiences, feelings of oneness with my surroundings, feelings of harmony, and a sense of the interconnectedness of all things, a feeling of meaning. Um, but at the time, I didn't understand those experiences. I thought they meant that I was a bit crazy, and I didn't tell anybody about them.
Yeah.
So for a long time, I went around thinking there was something slightly wrong with me. I thought, why am I having these strange experiences? Why do I appear to be different from other people? And I was quite an unusual teenager as well. I was very kind of socially, I didn't really have any social skills, so I spent most of my time alone. But it was only when I was in my early 20s, then I maybe chanced in inverted commas, to discover a book about mysticism, mystical experiences, a kind of anthology of mystical experiences. And I thought, wow, this is familiar. This is what I've been experiencing. So that book opened up a whole landscape of spirituality to me. I suddenly had a framework to make sense of myself. I thought, yeah, I'm not crazy after all, or maybe I am, but
But there's
but
others.
there's a whole world of craziness out there. Um, so yeah, I began to sort of understand and accept myself, and suddenly I was exploring this magical landscape of spirituality.
And you're a psychologist, aren't you?
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
3 days a week, a part-time psychologist.
Yeah, yeah. And did you come to psychology later in life or
I did, yeah. I mean, I was always interested in psychology, but a lot of psychology is quite kind of arid, quite barren, and sort of scientific and statistical. So I wasn't interested in that kind of psychology. But I was always interested in two of my heroes are and were always, well, for a long time, people like Abraham Maslow,
yeah.
William James. So there are psychologists who are interested in spirituality, psychologists who studied spirituality from a psychological point of view. So for a long time, I had a kind of inkling that that was what I was interested in. But for a long time, I didn't really do anything. I was a musician for a long time,
How
and
are you?
well, yeah.
Mm.
So that was my main sort of my main avenue in life for a long time. But I had an instinct to be a writer as well. And eventually I realized that I should be writing. Initially, I wrote a lot of fiction, and I've always written poetry. I still write poetry now. But at a certain point, I realized that I should be writing about spiritual and psychological issues, which I began to do in my late 20s. And soon after that, I found out about a little, still fairly little known field of psychology called transpersonal psychology,
Yeah.
which is the kind of academic study of spirituality, not in a kind of reductionist scientific way, but in a very open-minded spiritual way. So I began to move into the field of transpersonal psychology. I did a PhD, and I began to do research in that area.
Yeah. And a lot of your research has been about people's experiences of awakening, hasn't it? Was that what your PhD was about?
Exactly, yeah. My PhD was probably the only one of the few PhDs on spiritual awakening. It was a, it was,
Amazing to do that.
yeah,
Amazing. Yeah.
yeah. I sometimes think, wow, how did I get away with that? But luckily, I had a very open-minded supervisor who was also interested in spirituality. So I studied cases of spontaneous spiritual awakening, 25 cases of people who reported a sudden and apparently spontaneous moment of spiritual awakening, which then became a permanent state.
Yeah. That's one of the things I wanted to ask you about because, I know that, I quoted Eckhart Tolle in your bio. I know that, Eckhart has written the forewords to certainly to your new book. I don't know about the others, but I read your book and I saw that Eckhart had written the foreword, and he had a spontaneous awakening. And I was kind of guessing that you hadn't, that yours had been a more unfolding. I may be wrong
Mm.
about that, but from what you've said, it sounds as if it maybe was more progressive. So
Yeah.
what's the difference, do you think, in those 25 people that you studied for your PhD and for others of us whose awakening has been more gradual?
I've always believed that awakening is much more common than most people realize.
Yeah.
It's not kind of esoteric, extraordinary state which only a few people who've meditated for decades, who live in monasteries in Tibet or India and so forth. It's not just the experience of those people. And my research has confirmed that it is actually, I wouldn't say it's a common, but it's not uncommon. And there are actually a lot of people out there in the world, in the everyday world, who experience some degree of spiritual awakening, maybe without realizing it.
Without knowing it, yeah.
Yeah, because a lot of people don't know anything about spiritual practices or spiritual traditions or teachers, so they don't interpret their own experience in those terms. But I in my book, The Leap, I suggest that there are three ways in which awakening can occur. The first is when it's just natural and innate to a person, which was probably my experience. Maybe, if you believe in reincarnation, maybe it's carried over from previous life. And for those people, they don't need to meditate, or they don't need to undergo a sudden transformational experience. It's just naturally there. All they need to do really is to understand and integrate their natural spirituality into their lives, which can be tricky sometimes, especially in our culture, which doesn't really support spirituality in general. So yeah, those people often become artists, maybe poets, or maybe musicians, maybe painters. So if you look back at the history of poetry or art, painting, there are lots of naturally awakened people, poets and painters, like William Wordsworth, naturally awakened poet.
I love the
Um,
feeling clouds of glory.
yeah, yeah, that's beautiful. It's beautiful.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah, so many beautiful spiritual passages.
yeah,
My favorite poet is Walt Whitman. The American poet
yeah, yeah.
Walt
That's
Whitman.
yeah. We contain multitudes, he said, didn't he?
Yeah, yeah. Do I contradict myself? Very well. I contradict myself. I am large. I contain multitudes.
Yeah.
It's a good answer when people accuse you of contradicting yourself. Um, so yeah, the second way in which wakefulness or awakening can manifest itself is when it's gradual. And I think that's probably the most common way. There are many millions of people around the world who follow some form of spiritual practice. Maybe not even a formal spiritual practice, maybe some kind of practice which is part of their lives, like a practice of service. which they follow in their lives, or a kind of an attentiveness which they follow in their lives. I once, one of the people I interviewed for my PhD, which you mentioned just before, she'd actually undergone an awakening process due to her role as an air steward or an air stewardess. And she worked for British Airways for about 20 years. And
Gosh.
she said that in retrospect, she realized that her job was all about service and attentiveness. So she was spending several hours, each journey, just being attentive to people's needs and serving people. And later she realized it was a spiritual practice. It was a way of transcending the ego. So yeah, that's the probably the most common way, following a spiritual practice or a spiritual path of some form. So over years, sometimes even decades, you undergo a gradual process of awakening, which becomes more intense over time as you gradually undo the boundaries of the ego, or soften the boundaries of the ego, so you become more connected to others and more connected to your own innate spirituality. But the third way in which awakening can occur is when it's very sudden and dramatic. And that's usually caused by intense suffering of some form, intense psychological turmoil. And that's been one of my main areas of research. I've studied many, many cases of sudden spiritual awakening following a period of intense turmoil, which could be a diagnosis of cancer. It could be a long period of depression or addiction. It could be a divorce. It could be a bereavement. It doesn't really matter what form the turmoil or trauma takes. It just needs to be, usually it needs to be intense over quite a long period. And at a certain point, the normal ego just breaks down under the pressure. Or maybe there's a slow process of kind of undoing psychological attachments, which leads to an ego collapse. And when that happens, I mean, obviously everybody goes through trauma and turmoil many times in their lives. It's part of the human experience. But not everybody goes through this transformation. But for the people who do go through the transformation, it's almost as if there is a latent awakened self within them, which is waiting to emerge. It's fully formed. It's ready to emerge, just like a chick, which is ready to hatch
Mm.
from an egg. So when the ego breaks down, there's suddenly a space for this new self to emerge into. So the new self emerges. It kind of takes over as their new identity, and it becomes established for the rest of their lives. People sometimes ask, once this transformation occurs, is it permanent, or do some people return to their previous state? And usually, well, almost always, it seems to be permanent, because once a new self is born, then it can't be you can't be unborn. Human beings can't be unborn once we're born. So it does tend to remain stable. And again, there's sometimes a process of integration. Sometimes people are slightly confused because their experience is so different. They feel so different. So maybe sometimes they think they've gone a bit crazy again. But usually, well, almost always, they slowly gravitate to spiritual teachings and spiritual practices to make sense of what's happened to them. And eventually they do make sense of it, and they start to live at a higher functioning level.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember reading a while ago about Suzanne Segal, who you probably know that story, do you? Who just had a sudden awakening as she was stepping onto a bus in Paris.
Mm,
It took
mm.
her many, many years to even recognize that what had happened to her was a spiritual awakening. She thought that, that she'd had developed a real mental illness.
Yeah, that's not uncommon. Interviewed a guy who he was living a very adventurous life. He was a captain of a ship, um, but he eventually ended up in an African prison because, without knowing it, he'd been transporting weapons and was sent to prison in Africa. And as you can imagine, he was living in terrible conditions in the prison. And after a few weeks, he began to undergo a shift. And in prison is one of the situations in which awakening can occur, actually, because when people are in prison, they have no choice. Well, they often have no choice but to go inside themselves, because the external environment is so turbulent. and so awful that they're forced. Well, some people are kind of forced to retreat, to examine their own selves, to go into themselves. And also, when you're in prison, you have to detach yourself from all external things. Everything which constitutes your identity is on the other side of the prison walls. So you have to let go of your identity, which is, for many people that's a really awful experience, and that's why so many prisoners, take drugs and or sleep as much as they can. But for some prisoners, it can be liberating, and that's what happened to this gentleman. So when he got out of prison after about 6 months, was returned to England, but he didn't know what happened to him. He felt so different. He felt this new sense of heightened awareness. Everything was much more real. He felt intensely connected to nature, intensely empathic and compassionate to other people. So he felt so different, but he had no way of making sense of it because he didn't know anything about spirituality. So he actually bought a textbook of psychiatric disorders and sort of leafed through the book trying to find out what happened
Right.
to him. But
Yeah.
am I bipolar? Is this schizophrenia? But luckily, he didn't find any condition in the psychiatric book. So, and shortly afterwards, he found a book about spirituality, a book of spiritual teachings. Of, this is my condition. This is what's happened to me. So yeah, that's not uncommon. But she had difficulties integrating her new state, didn't she?
She did. Yeah.
Mhm.
I think she met Jean Klein, and he helped her, and then later Stephen Bodian helped her as well.
Oh,
It's
I know Stephen, but I didn't realize he was connected to her.
yeah, yeah.
Um,
He actually wrote. She wrote a book called Collision with the Infinite, and I think Stephen wrote the foreword to that book. Yeah,
oh wow,
worked with her a bit. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. So the your book, The Adventure, a practical guide to spiritual awakening. You say in that pretty much anybody can wake up. That there's a kind of process that you can follow. So is that the case? Can people who are listening to this think, well, first of all, why would you want to wake up? And what what is your definition of awakening? I'm going to ask you a whole load of questions all at once here. But yeah, and can we decide to do it? What's your take
Um,
on all of that?
in my view, anybody can do it to a certain degree. In my view, there are different degrees of wakefulness. It's a whole continuum. I refer to the normal human state as a state of sleep, and just as there are different stages of sleep, there are stages of deeper sleep. So that's true. Some human beings are more deeply asleep than others, and some human beings are more awakened than others. But you can move along the continuum. You can, even if you've attained a certain degree of wakefulness, you can obviously attain a higher degree of wakefulness. You can move further along the continuum. But my perspective is that there are certain practices which can enable a person to move beyond the sleep state into a state of wakefulness. And these practices. Let's say there are certain qualities. There are certain qualities um, which define wakefulness, and my book is orientated around those qualities. I specify 8 qualities in the book, um, such as gratitude, disidentification from the ego, altruism, presence, and so forth. So if you cultivate those qualities through certain practices, then it's inevitable that you will actually cultivate wakefulness, because wakefulness is those qualities. It consists of those qualities. So in that sense, I do think it's accessible to anybody. Maybe the only people maybe it isn't accessible to are people who exist in a state of extreme separation. And by that I mean people who could be diagnosed as psychopaths, or people who could be diagnosed as narcissists, whatever. The main characteristic of those states is extreme separation, extreme disconnection, um, with no empathy, no compassion, complete self-absorption, complete selfishness. So those people are so deeply asleep that it's probably difficult for them to move into wakefulness. but it's still theoretically possible. And I think you also asked about how I would define wakefulness.
Yeah.
I define it quite. It's one of those terms which is quite tricky to define. Everybody has a slightly different view of it, like enlightenment. I tend to avoid using the term enlightenment because it kind of suggests that it's something rarefied and extraordinary and kind of unattainable. But um, I would define wakefulness simply as an expansion and intensification of awareness. But I usually break that down into slightly more complex terms because there are different forms of awareness. Um, on one level, awakening is an intensification of perceptual awareness because the world becomes more real and more beautiful. A kind of veil of familiarity falls away, and suddenly, wow, the world's more intensely real. It's a bit like returning to childhood perception, a kind of fresh, vivid perception of young children. There's also an expansion of subjective awareness because we become aware of deeper levels of our own being. We journey deeper into our own nature. Um, we discover a kind of a harmony and well-being within ourselves. There's also an expansion of what I call intersubjective awareness, which means that we become more deeply connected to other people, more empathic, more compassionate, more altruistic. So yeah, but basically it's the same process of expansion. You could also speak about it in terms of an expansion of identity. You know, for many people, their identity is egoic. It's associated with their own mind and body. But when we undergo awakening, we connect with other human beings more intensely. We connect with nature more intensely. So it's as if our sense of being, maybe identity is the wrong word. Let's say our sense of being expands to incorporate more and more until eventually, at the more intense levels of wakefulness, there's a sense of complete oneness. We share our being with the whole world, the whole universe.
So the other question that I asked you was, why would anybody want to wake up?
Well, why would anybody not want to? It's
That's from the other side, the Steve.
that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's a good question. If you are living in the kind of sleep state, if you feel as though many people feel as though they're enjoying themselves, they're having some interesting and exciting experiences, um, you know, pleasures and distractions and entertainments. Yes, it's a reasonable question. But as the Buddha said, the normal human state is one of suffering. It's a state of separation. And I always say, I've mentioned this in several of my books, that the essential cause of a lot of human behavior is a desire to escape separateness. So many human beings have this drive to distract themselves, the drive to turn on the television, the drive to do anything other than sit quietly with your own self. You reach for your iPhone or open up a magazine, turn on your computer, phone up friends to fill your free time. And obviously, I'm not denouncing all of those things in entirety, but there is this strong desire to escape from yourself, to distract yourself, which many human beings devote a lot of time to. And that stems from a desire to escape your own self, a desire to escape the separateness and the unease within your own self in the normal state. And the same applies to the desire to accumulate wealth or power or achievements. It's rooted in a desire to or to escape separateness. It's rooted in a desire to add things to your life because you feel incomplete. So you add possessions to yourself and hoping that they will make you feel more stronger and more complete. It doesn't work, but you carry on trying to
Keep
gain more and more possessions. Yeah, the swimming pool didn't make you happy, so maybe you need a more expensive car or maybe some more expensive clothes. But it's a never-ending process. Same with power and achievement. However much you achieve, it doesn't satisfy you because it can't alleviate your incompleteness. It can't take away this sense of lack. So yeah, that in the normal human state, separateness causes a massive amount of suffering, and the desire to escape it dominates people's lives. So only when you undergo a certain degree of spiritual development, then you begin to transcend separateness. And then all of this pathological behavior fades away, the desire to destruct yourself, the desire to accumulate possessions, because the sense of lack is no longer there, So, and when that happens, your life becomes much, much easier. You become able to be, rather than just to do. Um, and then you really begin to live. That's when life really begins. When you start to realize that the point of life is not to achieve or to have or to think. It's to be. It's to relish being in the world. And it doesn't mean you stop being active. You still have impulses to help others, to contribute to the world. But yeah, you begin to live in a much more fulfilling and meaningful way.
I think that's something that's just, you know, becoming more and more obvious, because I think, there's been a view that if you're interested in spirituality or whatever, that you withdraw from the world, that
Mm.
you in the past, it necessitated really going to live in an ashram, or finding a guru, or kind of with really withdrawing from the world and the normal concerns of the world. And so, but it seems more and more to be, people are starting to talk about living an awakened life, in the
Mm.
midst of an ordinary 21st century life.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. That is a big change. But I think it's one of the biggest myths about spiritual awakening, that it makes people, or about spirituality in general, that it makes people withdraw from the world and people become indifferent and detached from the world. I don't think that's the case. And based on my research, almost everybody who participated in my research, everybody who's undergone a spiritual awakening, they become more, well, in some ways, they become more active because they become more altruistic. They have a strong desire to contribute to the world, to help others. And that's because once you transcend suffering, you become more aware of, you become more aware and more concerned about other people's well-being. And when other people are in a state of suffering, you feel a strong desire to alleviate their suffering. So that naturally manifests itself in altruism. And you also relish, connection with other people too. I mean, I think one of the striking things about awakened people is that they are very capable of being alone. They relish their own company. They really love doing nothing. And solitude is quite a kind of spiritual experience for them, because it allows them to connect with themselves and to connect with the world. So, they don't need to be with other people all the time. But at the same time, they relish other people's company. They relish the authentic connection they have with other people. They really enjoy creating bonds with other people. Um, you know, but I've often pointed out that all of the greatest social activists in history were very spiritually developed people. Gandhi,
Yeah.
Martin Luther King, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, Nelson Mandela, I think, was a spiritually developed person. And my favorite example is Florence Nightingale, who
Yeah.
is not very well known, but she was a very spiritually developed person.
Mm.
And later in life, she wrote books about Christian mysticism.
Ah, I didn't know that. Wow.
No, she was, yeah. The back in her in her era, she was such a famously, active person that they called it Nightingale energy. She had this tremendous force that drove her to alleviate suffering and to, alleviate terrible social conditions, sanitation, terrible sanitary conditions, and so forth. And the ground of that was her spirituality, her sense of empathy, and her mission, to serve the human race. And yeah, so there's no reason that spiritual awakening should entail a withdrawal from the world. Maybe at a certain, but maybe in the beginning, when you're sort of training, when you're practicing, maybe it is necessary sometimes to withdraw for a while. and that's probably the purpose of monasteries. The real purpose is to allow people to undergo spiritual training of some kind. But once that's done, then you can re-enter the world, and then you can engage more authentically with the world.
How has awakening affected your work as a psychologist? What does that bring to your work?
Hmm. Uh, it brings a sense of compassion. I mean, when I'm one to one, when I'm speaking with students, sometimes I have clients, and I feel as though I can connect with something below the surface. You know, people often present a kind of mask, a kind of social mask, particularly young people, because they feel as though they have to adopt a mask to function with their peers. But I feel as though you know I have the ability to see beneath that mask and to connect with something deeper. So often when I'm working on a one-to-one basis, I feel this kind of deep connection with people, and it even manifests itself in my perceptions or my vision. My vision often becomes sort of hazy, and there's a sort of radiance in the room, and it feels as if beneath our surface personalities, there's some deep interconnection. Something is kind of happening below the surface. It's kind of a merging of identities, I think, and I think that's that's very therapeutic. It's a healing process. So I think people benefit from that because they sense it as well, even if they're not conscious of it. They sense this kind of radiant presence and this deep connection. So it can be quite powerful.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, I know what you mean. I know what you mean.
Yeah, have you experienced that?
Yeah, yeah. Almost like I would say it sometimes feels like the air is thick. Do you know what I
Yeah.
mean? It's almost like there's an actual palpable something, and at
Mm.
that point, words don't matter.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's very palpable, and time ceases to exist, or ceases at least ceases to matter. So there's kind of like a dissolution of separateness, and also a transcendence of time. Um, yeah, and it can, yeah, and everything becomes quite slow as well. We can relax. There's a lot of silence,
yeah.
and it's as if something is manifesting itself, and you just need to allow it to manifest itself. It can happen. I think it's more powerful in person, but it can happen on Zoom calls, on the internet too.
Yeah, yeah, it certainly can. Yeah,
Mm,
I often
mm,
feel in those circumstances that um, the as you say, the slowing down and the not formulating words, but the words coming and the person saying, "That's the exactly." How did you know that? Or how,
mm,
that's someone was just talking about that yesterday, or this is what's been on my mind, or whatever, in a way of, yeah,
mm.
sort of
Yeah,
tapping into some kind of intuitive wisdom.
yeah, that's right. There's something creative about it too. I think sometimes when I'm writing, I get into a similar state, particularly when I'm writing poetry.
Yeah, I write poetry as well. Uh,
Yeah, in this state, it's as if you become a channel. You don't really know what you're writing, and you're kind of surprised that, oh, where did that come from?
Woo! Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah,
I
do you write poetry on spiritual themes?
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Mm,
yeah.
mm.
I've just published one collection. It's called Endless Namaste Poems of Awakening.
Oh, right. I'd like to read. I'd like to read it. That
Yeah,
sounds good.
yeah. I'll send you a copy.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I'd love to read it. It's
Um,
interesting that there is this amazing connection between spirituality and poetry.
Yeah, let's talk about that actually. What is
Yeah,
that?
yeah.
What is that? Because I was a mathematician, maths teacher,
Oh, yeah.
never wrote a poem in my entire life. I mean, poetry, what? And then all of a sudden, it started to, I did a lot of journaling. So, I had a whole breakdown kind of, and then, an awakening. And I started to journal, and then it started to come in little lines in my journal. And then I'd think, oh, that's like a poem. And then I thought, oh, no, it is a poem. And then it just, every now and again it would just happen. And then I used to share them in meetings and stuff, and then people would say to me, oh, you should publish those. So I looked back, and I had, at the point I looked back, I had written 30 of them. I thought, that's a nice number. And I just
Mm, mm.
self-published the book, through Amazon Kindle.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, it's, and
Mm.
I adapted that, the practice of lectio divina that
Yeah,
Christian
yeah.
Mystics used to use to contemplate scripture. I
Mm.
adapted the Lectio Divina process as a means of contemplating poetry. And I lead a class in that every couple of
Oh,
weeks.
brilliant.
And last week I used your poem, The Wave.
Oh,
So I wanted
really?
to tell you that. Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
right. That's great.
Yeah, it was
Ah.
so good. It was so good for that process of of really inquiring and allowing the words to be received, and what the
Mm.
response was to. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
I mean, my experience was similar. I used to write poetry when I was a teenager, and it continued into my early 20s. But at a certain point, it just kind of ebbed away, and I kind of thought, well, that's it now. Poetry's kind of over for me. But it's probably about 15 years ago now, maybe longer. I can't remember exactly. But it just sort of came back for some reason. But like you, I find myself sort of jotting down some things. Oh, what's that? Looks a bit like a poem, you know.
Yeah.
And then I realized, yeah, it is a poem. I'm writing poetry. And I don't know why it came back or where it come from. And the kind of poems I was writing now was completely different to the ones I written as a teenager. And it felt like, one of the reasons why I gave up poetry as a teenager or in my early 20s, because it just didn't feel right. I didn't have a voice. I didn't really know what I was trying to express. Or I didn't express it very well. But when it came back 15 years ago, I just had naturally had a voice. It was my voice. It was very easy to write poems, and it's been the same ever since. I never know when they're going to come. Sometimes they don't come for a few weeks, and I think, what's happened to my poetry? Then all of a sudden it'll just come back, maybe in a meditation or when I'm going for a run or something. Something will pop into my mind. Um, so yeah, it's wonderful. I mean, it goes back to a lot of gurus have been poets as well. A lot of great spiritual teachers were poets. Um, in some cases you can't divide. You can't. There's no dividing line between spiritual teacher and poet, like Rumi, Hafiz, were the great kind of Persian poets, and
Lovely.
the British tradition, William Blake and William Wordsworth and Shelley and D.H. Lawrence and people like that. And every country has got great spiritual poets.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
One of my
it's
favorites at the moment is an American guy called Fred Lamott. Are you
no, I
familiar?
don't know.
Oh, Steve, you need to look him up.
Fred
Al
Lamont.
Alfred K. Lamotte, Lamotte, just exquisite,
Right.
exquisite mystical poetry, beautiful. He's
All
a
right.
he's kind of is similar to you actually because he teaches in a university, um, and just yeah, there's real similarities between
All
your
right.
work.
So he's a contemporary figure. He's
He's a
alive now.
contemporary, yeah,
All
yeah.
right.
He's on. He posts poetry all the time on his Facebook page, and he's got several
Yeah.
collections. Just gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous.
Oh, right. Well,
Yeah,
I'll
it's
look into
got that same feel, the same kind of
it.
yeah.
Right. I've been reading a Portuguese poet called Fernando Pessoa. And he died, I think, in the late 1930s, but he's also a great spiritual poet. There were a lot of very simple nature poetry.
Yeah.
You
How would you spell his last name?
Pessoa, that's Pessoa.
Not heard of him. I'll look him up.
Yeah, no, he's great, and he's a very interesting guy. But I think he fluctuated between awakening experiences and depression. You know, he didn't really integrate his spirituality very well, but he expressed it in his poems.
So, you said that in your book, the adventure, you identified 8 qualities of awakening. So, can we just speak quite briefly about those? I really recommend that people read that book actually. Um, so, just to give them a little taster.
Mhm.
So, I wrote them all down in case you couldn't remember all 8 off the top of your
Well,
head.
I think I've got a good grasp of them by now.
Yeah. So you've mentioned the first one already, disidentification from the ego mind. What does that mean? So what's the ego in what's your definition of the ego?
The ego is a sense of self which is based on thought. Um, there's a large element of social conditioning as well, but it's kind of like a superficial, constructed self, which a lot of people believe is their real self. They become so identified with it and so immersed in it that they don't realize that there is a part of them which is beyond it, which transcends it. So when you disidentify with it, that's when you realize, oh, I'm not my ego, I'm not my thoughts. There's a part of me which can stand back and observe those thoughts, which witnesses those thoughts. So then that's the I sometimes refer to that as the gateway into awakening because that's the most important initial stage. And once you take that, once you take that first step, then the whole landscape of spiritual awakening is open to you.
Mm, yeah. And then the second one is gratitude. Gratitude for what?
Gratitude for everything. I sometimes say that human beings live in a state of taking for grantedness. We take everything for granted. It's only when something is taken away, then we thought, oh, damn, this is actually something really precious. If I ever get this back, maybe it's your health, maybe it's a person that
I
you've
was going to
taken for
say
granted.
health. People
Yeah,
often say that when they've had a health scare or yeah.
yeah, that's right. And also life itself. A lot of people take life itself for granted. They think, well, they don't really think about it, but they just take it for granted. But if you have a brush with mortality, then you realize how fragile, how temporary, how precious life in this body is, in this form, in this world. So then, once you experience that gratitude, there's a shift in perspective. Often people do return to taking for grantedness, but often an element of gratitude becomes an ongoing trait. But it's something that you can cultivate as well. You can cultivate gratitude for your health, for your body, for people, for the natural world, for everything. So I suggest certain practices to do that.
And then number 3 is presence.
Presence is one of the essential qualities which naturally develops in awakening. The ability, well, I have this concept which I call the 3 A's, and these are the 3 states in which human beings spend their lives. The first one is abstraction, when we're immersed in our thoughts. The second is absorption, when we're immersed in activities or entertainments or other external things. And the third A is awareness. That's when our attention is simply um, kind of spread over our surroundings. It kind of rests gently within our experience. So we don't need to immerse our attention in thoughts or activities. We're simply aware of our surroundings, aware of our own experience, of our perceptions and sensations. And so presence means spending our time in a state of awareness, being present to our experience and to our surroundings rather than immersed in thoughts or activities. And that's the essence of presence. And as I say, it's something that you can cultivate, and it's something that arises naturally in spiritual awakening.
And number 4 is altruism, which you've spoken a little bit about.
Altruism arises from transcending separation. Once you connect with other people, then you become aware of their suffering or their desire to grow, and you have this natural impulse to help them, to alleviate their suffering or to help them to grow. Or it could be just contributing more generally to the world through your creativity or your wisdom, your teachings. And I mean, every spiritual tradition emphasizes the importance of altruism. It's one of those qualities which is just embedded into spirituality.
And yet, in some traditions, there's this concept of the world's an illusion.
Yeah.
And so, I don't need to watch the news. I don't need to know what's going on because it's all an illusion anyway. So speak to that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a bit extreme. I mean, it's true that you don't need to watch the news, but you can respond to the suffering of other people around you. And if you sense that the world, it, you know, the world is being damaged, or nature is being damaged by human activity, then you feel a natural impulse to alleviate that suffering, to help particular causes. Um, so I think when people say that the world is an illusion, I think it's usually a form of spiritual bypassing. When people are using spirituality to escape from their own issues and problems. If you say that the world is an illusion, it's a very easy way of escaping from your own issues, and also a way of escaping from your responsibility to other human beings and to the world. So I'm a bit dubious about that perspective. What do you think?
I agree with you.
Mm.
Yes, I agree. I think it can be just like, the teaching that, I'm not my body can be used as a means of bypassing, and to not deal with trauma or any, to engage in any kind of purification or releasing of shadow material. I think often people just skip right over that.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
then we hear things like, I've been doing these spiritual practices for 35 years and it's not working because there's still all of that undigested material
mm,
that has just been put into the bag of the world's an illusion. I'm not my body. I don't even need to look at it anymore. I feel that spirituality can become a series of concepts. Um,
yeah.
so yeah, and we'll get to that because you've got that in, in one of your list. So if we go to number five, first of all, acceptance. Acceptance of what? What is acceptance?
Um, Acceptance means not resisting reality, not resisting the reality of your life. I mean, there are many people who spend a lot of time resisting reality, resisting things that they can't change, resisting the past, for example, feeling bitter about past experiences, feeling resentful to people who've caused them harm in the past. You can't change the past, so you have no choice but to accept it. And it's the same with, there are certain elements of your life that you may not like and that you decide to resist. And even if you sense that something isn't quite right in your life, even if you sense that you should follow a different road or a different path towards a different life situation, you still need to accept the situation you're in right now. And if you resist it, then it will cause conflict. It creates a duality between you and reality. And you could talk about resistance to death, for example. A lot of people resist the idea of death. They try not to think about it or talk about it. But we're all going to die. So we have no choice but to acknowledge and accept death. And when we do that, it has quite a powerful transformational effect. So yeah, so when we move into a mode of acceptance, even if it's something as simple as accepting our daily chores or responsibilities, or the people, relatives that we spend our lives with, there is a big shift. I refer to it as the alchemy of acceptance. You know, there's a major shift when we drop resistance and move into a state of oneness with our lives.
You like things starting with A, Steve. You've had three A's and then the alchemy of acceptance.
Yeah, I've also got a poem. I've got a poem called "The Alchemy of Attention" too.
Yeah. Yeah, and speaking about Rumi before, I think one of one of the most wonderful poems on acceptance is The Guest House by Rumi. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah,
So yeah, simple and beautiful.
yeah, yeah. Because
Mm.
I think often people think, you know, I'll welcome these difficult emotions or difficult situations because then they'll go away.
Mm.
Um, yeah, I
But
think
yeah, that's that attitude itself is one of resistance, isn't it?
yes, yes,
Mhm.
exactly. Okay, so then number six is integration. So speak about integration. What's
That's based on the body. That means integrating with our bodies. Um, one of the facts that emerged from my research was that when people undergo awakening, they develop a new attitude to their body, and usually a much more positive attitude. They start to care for their bodies more. They start to care for their diets. They sometimes become vegetarians or vegans. They become more physically sensitive, and also they start to exercise more. Maybe they do yoga because they feel more in harmony with their bodies. Their body is no longer separate to them. So in the same way that they no longer feel separate to other people, they no longer feel separate to their own bodies. So there's this sort of tremendous feeling of ease and harmony with their bodies. So in view of the fact that, as you kind of alluded to before, that in spirituality there is sometimes a slightly ambivalent attitude to the body. Some traditions suggest that the body is an illusion. Some suggest that it's just a kind of vehicle that we live inside. It's not really that important. We should just sort of take care, satisfy its basic needs, but not really pay too much attention to it. But I think that's a misguided attitude. So awakening does bring this sense of the preciousness of the body, and the sense that the body is not other to us. It is part of spirit. The body is a manifestation of spirit. I love the poem by Walt Whitman. Can't remember which poem it is, but he lists all of the different parts of the body, and he says something like, "These are not other to the soul. These are all part of the soul. I say to you that the body is the soul." So there's no duality between the body and soul. They're all part of spiritual oneness.
lovely? Number seven is detachment.
This When I use the term detachment here, I'm referring to dissolving psychological attachments. So a lot of one of the normal human traits is to derive our identity from psychological attachments. So that could mean an attachment to possessions, an attachment to our role in society, to our profession, to our role in our families. It could mean an attachment to ambitions. Um, could mean an attachment to past achievements, which define our identity. So identity is derived from all of these external things, and every spiritual tradition emphasizes the importance of letting go of these attachments, to not defining yourself in terms of your possessions, in terms of your outward role, in terms of your beliefs or ambitions. So that is part of the awakening process, is letting go of these external attachments and realizing that your true essential identity is within. And the more you depend on external things for your identity, the less access you have to this internal wholeness and well-being, which is our essential self.
And finally, number eight, embracing mortality.
I sort of alluded to this just before. We're talking about the importance of acknowledging and accepting the fact that we live in this temporary form, in these temporary bodies, and viewing life as a process. Life is a process that began when we were conceived, when we were born, when we grew into adulthood. But it's a process which will end at some point. And just being aware that life is temporary and fragile and precious, it has a tremendous power. And I think that's why, when I've met a lot of people who've undergone spiritual awakening through being diagnosed with a serious illness like cancer. And often when a person is diagnosed with cancer, they have this sudden awareness of the reality of death and the preciousness of life. So that kind of whole that whole state of taking for grantedness suddenly falls away. And it's basically about being aware of the reality of death. That in itself can have an awakening effect. So that's why, I place a lot of importance on that. And even if you believe that there is some form of continuation, I believe that there is some form of continuation after death. But still, this our existence in this form is still fragile and precious and beautiful.
I love the I love the Buddhist thing about the preciousness of a human birth. That taking a human birth is as rare as a turtle sticking its head through a ring in the middle of a vast ocean.
Really. I
Yeah,
heard
yeah.
that. That's
Just
great.
imagine that visual, of a huge ocean and a little ring, a wee turtle poking its head up. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a real privilege. I mean, it's, as the Buddha also said, life involves suffering,
Mm,
but still, on the most basic level, it's a privilege and a joy to be alive in this form,
yeah.
in this world.
So, for people who are listening, if you want to learn more about those 8 qualities of awakening, then, as I said, highly recommend Steve's book. But if you want to delve into 4 of them in great detail with Steve, then Steve, you are teaching a 4-part class for us at Centre for Awakening called 4 Steps to Awakening, Cultivating the Qualities of Spiritual Enlightenment, where you're going to be talking about 4 of the 8: the disidentification from the ego mind, gratitude, presence, and acceptance. So I wanted to ask you, first of all, why did you choose those 4 to focus on for this class from the 8?
Partly because I suggest in the book that all qualities are roughly equivalent, but I think those 4 in particular are, really fundamental, really essential. The first one in particular, as I mentioned before, it's kind of like the gateway into awakening. You can't really undergo awakening without going through that process of disidentification. And also I think those particular qualities, they're quite overt and easy to work with. They're, on a practical level, they are quite easy to cultivate. There are certain practices which we can use to cultivate them. So yeah, they're particularly easy to work with.
So what kind of things will you be doing in these classes? What could people expect if they wanted to come and join us?
We're doing meditations based on those qualities. So I'll be guiding people through meditations to awaken those qualities. But also I'll be guiding people through what I call contemplative exercises. When I ask people to contemplate certain aspects of their own lives and of life itself. And also some visualizations. I think visualization exercises can be powerful. So I'll be leading some of those. But it's also part of it is about developing self-awareness. So I'll be helping people to become aware of the ways in which they naturally experience presence in their lives, and also the ways in which they habitually escape from presence. The kind of strategies that we use in our lives to not be present. So I'll be helping people to become aware of those traits and those qualities.
And will you be sharing any of your poetry?
Yes, yeah, yeah. I think poetry, reading and listening to poetry can be a spiritual practice, as you mentioned earlier, lectio divina.
Yeah,
So yeah, in on that theme, I will be reading some poetry. Yeah, I think in every session I'll be reading 2 or 3 poems.
great. And will there be an opportunity for people to ask you questions and to dialogue with you as well?
Yeah, yeah. I think maybe around 20 minutes, half an hour at the end of every session people will be able to ask questions and to make comments, and we'll have some discussions.
Good. Good. I'm looking forward to it. So that begins in July. Yes, 4 Mondays in July. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, well, I
everyone
really look
looking forward
forward
to it.
to that, Steve, and thanks so much for talking to me. So, if you're interested in joining Steve for that 4 week class, then we'll put all the details that you need in the show notes for this podcast. So, you'll be able to sign up and join both of us on that journey in July. So, thank you so much, Steve. It's been lovely talking to you.
Yeah, thank you, Susan. Yeah, it was a delight. It was a delightful. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye bye, everybody. Bye bye.
Bye, everybody.